Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today as we talk about a very important topic: what's at stake for women and girls during this election cycle. My name is Felicia Davis, and I am the president and CEO of Chicago Foundation for Women. I'm sure you're all aware that we have an election taking place as we speak. Early voting has begun across our state and in many areas across the country. Due to the pandemic, this election is a bit different. More people are planning their vote than in previous years, and many in Illinois, an anticipated 2 million, are voting by mail, the most in any recent election year. These next few weeks are critical for us all, but especially for women and girls. There are continued attacks on our livelihoods, healthcare, safety, or personal safety, economic security, many of which are impacted by our votes. This year marked the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave white women the right to vote. Black women, many of whom were instrumental to the suffrage movement, were not included in the final amendment. Since then, there has been a noticeable gender gap between women and men voters. Since 1980, the percentage of female voters, adults who voted, has exceeded the proportion of male adults who voted. And in 2016, women cast 9.8 million more votes than men, according to the US Census. That's 9.8 million more votes than men. Did I say that? 9.8 more million votes than men. That can definitely make or break the election. Furthermore, according to the New York Times, when we look at Black women and Latinas, the gender gap often grows. In other words, the very women that were denied access to the ballot 100 years ago have become powerful voting blocs with significant political influence. This year, the gender gap could prove decisive in the presidential election, as President Trump currently lags far behind his opponent, Joe Biden. Among registered female voters in every national poll tracked by the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University. But the election for this president is not the only race on our ballots, and that's really important. Today, we'll talk about what to look for on our ballot, the full ballot from the top of it to the bottom, what races could prove impactful locally, as well as the issues that could be impacted through our votes. Now, I would like to introduce Ajin Pu, an award-winning organizer, social innovator, author, and a leading voice in the women's movement. She is the executive director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, directing of Care Across Generations, co-founder of Supermajority, and trustee of the Ford Foundation. Ajin is a nationally recognized expert on elder and family care, the future of work, gender equity, immigration, narrative change, and grassroots organizing. She is the author of the celebrated book, The Age of Dignity: Preparing for the Elder Boom and Changing America. She was unable to join us live, but did want to share the following pre-recorded remarks.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for that warm introduction. And to everyone at the Chicago Foundation for Women, thank you so much for everything that you do every day for the women in our community. I've been thinking a lot about the next few weeks and the future ahead, and I've been reflecting on this weather pattern that's common to parts of the Midwest and the South in this country called a sunstorm. And it's when you have a really fierce storm, rain, sometimes even hail, but somehow in the midst of that, the sun is still shining through brightly. It's almost like a miracle. And I think what we've been experiencing in our country is a really fierce political sunstorm, where we have unprecedented attacks on our democracy, institutions, norms, practices of our democracy, and we have just constant threats on the values that we hold dear in this country. And at the same time, we have people throughout Chicago, Illinois, and this country, especially women, who keep showing up to march, to rally, to protest, to vote, to run for office, to protect our health care, to stop family separation. Women have done and continue to do so much to protect our democracy. We, as women, have been the first responders to a democracy in crisis, and we are actually the sun in this incredible political sunstorm that we're all living through. And the next few weeks, they are our moment. These next few weeks will decide what will be the realm of the possible for women and our families going forward. And for women like domestic workers, the Black, Latinx, Asian, Native, white, working class women who care and clean in our homes, the stakes could not be higher. Their literal lives and livelihoods and the future for their children are on the ballot. Our ability to care for our families and the people that we love, our ability to imagine a future where one generation can do better than the next, our ability to even begin to think about a green economy, a sustainable future, good jobs. All of these things are on the ballot. And I think women know it, but it's up to us to remind them. And we have a limited number of days to do that. And you may be thinking, it's a pandemic. I mean, we're still in the middle of the Rona. How am I going to prioritize this? Is it safe? Yes, it is safe. You can vote by mail. You can still request your ballot to vote by mail. And you can also figure out how to vote safely in person, which is what I'm going to do. And it is so important that we take steps now. Think about Election Day as starting now. And check if you're registered and go and figure out where your polling site is. Make sure you have all the information as early as possible. And if you're voting by mail, vote early, hand in your ballot early. Don't let that mail-in ballot sit on your dining room table and get buried under a pile of envelopes. Fill it out and get it out the door, because we want to know the results earlier, and earlier the better. The stakes could not be higher. And I know we can do it because we have been the sun in the storm, and we will continue to be the sun in the storm. And this is our moment to really, really shine.
Please join me in giving a very special thanks to Ajahn for her remarks. And I agree, we are the sun in the storm. And we must not be discouraged by what we've heard about voting recently. The pandemic continues to change the way we live our lives, and it will have and is having a significant impact on this election cycle. There has been and is every day a lot of conflicting information about voting this year, but we must not be deterred or discouraged. Here to help us make sense of voting this year is Matt Dietrich, Public Information Officer at the Illinois State Board of Elections. Matt joined the Illinois State Board of Elections in January 2018 as the agency's first public information officer. Prior to joining SBE, Matt worked for 30 years in journalism, including nearly 25 years at newspapers in New Jersey, New York, Wisconsin, and Illinois. He wrote extensively about Illinois government and politics as editorial page editor at the State Journal-Register in Springfield, and was the founding editor of government news website at Reboot Illinois. He also wrote fact-check articles on Illinois issues for PolitiFact and the Better Government Association. Matt, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you, Felicia. As already been mentioned, the conduct of this year's election is unlike anything that we have ever gone through before. Our legislature anticipated that we would be under a difficult situation on November 3rd. And in May, it passed a special election bill strictly for the 2020 general election. Governor Pritzker signed it into law in June. And the intent of that bill was twofold. And first, and probably the most visible aspect of it, probably the biggest change that we've seen for the general election cycle this year, is the emphasis on voting by mail. What we saw back in March for the primary, as the pandemic really went from being sort of an abstract concept in March 1st or so, to being a full-blown crisis in the days immediately before the March 17th primary. What happened was a lot of people really didn't want to go to polling places. We didn't quite know how serious the pandemic was at the time. People rushed to get vote by mail ballots. Some of them got them, some of them didn't. Turnout was fairly low, although not catastrophically low for a primary. But we knew that we needed to be prepared in November for the pandemic to be possibly worse than what we were experiencing in March. So the bill that was passed, number one, required that every registered voter in Illinois who had voted in any of the last 3 statewide elections, which was November of 2018, April of 2019, or the primary back in March, would receive a vote by mail application. So by August 1st, 6.4 million voters around Illinois received these applications made out specifically to them so that they could just put them back and sign them, put them back in the mail, and receive their vote by mail ballot. Those started going out on September 24th. We've already had a couple 100,000 vote by mail ballots actually returned. We're over 2 million now in voters who have applied for vote by mail ballots. So we're going to see a record many times over for voting by mail. We already know that. Previous high for votes cast by mail came just 2 years ago when about 9% of the vote was cast. That was 430,000 ballots back then. This year, we're going to see 2 million or more ballots cast, most likely. That could account for 1/3 or more of the total vote, depending on what the turnout ends up being. The other thing that, and by the way, there also were some special laws enacted regarding the process for approving and rejecting vote by mail ballots as they're received. In this election cycle, if there's something wrong with your ballot, if you forget to sign it, if your signature doesn't match, the election authority has 2 days in which they must notify you that there's a problem to allow you to rectify that. And if it's a signature issue, you can rectify that simply by giving your election authority a statement affirming that, in fact, that is a genuine ballot for me. The other thing that the bill did pertains to in-person voting. Gave the local election authorities a lot of flexibility for expanding their hours of early voting and for having things like curbside voting to help voters who want to vote in person but don't want to leave their car and go into a polling place or can't. So that also was part of the bill. And on November 3rd this year, Illinois is observing a state holiday, so schools will be closed. That allows, in fact, the law requires that local school districts allow their facilities to be used by local election authorities as polling places. That's very important because what we saw in March, especially in Chicago, were polling places that were scheduled to be open to the public, pulled out at the last minute. 185 locations in Chicago alone pulled out as of the weekend before the March primary. Really had them scrambling, happened to a certain extent statewide. This time around on November 3rd, if you're voting on election day, you're more than likely going to be voting in a school building. And if there are emergencies like judges don't show up, polls can't open, polling places have to be consolidated, they'll have school buildings that they can move into. So those are the main things. And one thing that I've been trying to say lately is that we've done a lot of talking about the details of voting by mail because we have so many more people doing it this time around. But it's really not that complicated. And the voting process really is not changing. It's just that you're going to see different things when you go to an early voting location or if you go into a polling place on election day. These are things that we're pretty much used to now in our daily lives with masks, hand sanitizer, spacing, those kinds of things. What we're trying to do this year here at the state level and also all the local election authorities is encourage people, plan your vote. Think about it now. If you don't want to go to a polling place, if you want to vote by mail, get your application in immediately. And then when you get that ballot, vote it as quickly as you can so that on election night, we can have as complete a picture as possible of what the actual vote by mail totals look like. We know that people generally in the past don't think much about how they're going to vote until right before the election. This year, we don't want that to happen. If you're going to vote in person, sure, that's fine. It's great. Think about voting early and think about voting early like right now or in the first couple of weeks of October or on October 19th when early voting expands, especially throughout Cook County in the suburbs and in Chicago when all 50 ward early voting sites are open. Don't wait until those last 4 or 5 days right before the election because we know that early voting sites can get crowded too. Trying to mitigate any crowding that we can, but don't be intimidated by any of this. If you want to vote by mail, it's the same basic process that we've always had in Illinois. You get your ballot, fill it out, put a good signature on it. Don't be sloppy. Send it back in. If there's a problem, you'll hear from your election authority. So plan your vote and get out and vote and don't be intimidated.
Matt, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing such critical information about the ways people can vote and the precautions being taken to ensure all are safe. We have no excuses now. Matt has given us the information we need to plan our vote. And now we're going to start the conversation about the issues at stake for women and girls in this election, both at the local and the national levels. And I'd like to introduce the remaining panelists. So first, Linda Sochi Tortelloro, the president and CEO of Mijeras Latinas en Acción, the nation's longest standing Latina organization. Under Linda's leadership, Mijeras is a fierce advocate on key issues such as gender-based violence, women's health and economic security, immigration, and reproductive justice. Linda serves on the Action Council of Illinois' Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights and the steering committee of the city clerk's Chicago Status of Women and Girls Working Group and is a steadfast partner with CFW. So welcome, Linda. Jennifer Welch, the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Illinois Action and Planned Parenthood of Illinois. Before joining Planned Parenthood, Jennifer was first deputy commissioner with the city of Chicago, the Department of Family and Support Services. She also served as policy director for Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan. And before her tenure in government, Jennifer was the executive director of the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network, which is the coalition of Chicagoland's domestic violence service providers. And serving as moderator for our conversation is Lolly Bowen, Program Officer of Media and Storytelling at the Field Foundation. Before joining Field, she was a general assignment reporter at the Chicago Tribune for more than 15 years, where she had a particular focus on urban affairs, youth culture, housing, minority communities, and government relations. She wrote primarily about Chicago's unique African-American community, and in recent years, the development of the Obama Presidential Library. Lolly will lead us in the conversation. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Felicia, for those fine introductions. And thank you to the speakers that preceded us, especially Matt, who has demystified this voting process that's already taking place in our city and in our state. And thank you to the audience for joining us this afternoon for this conversation titled Grab 'em by the Ballot, where we're going to discuss the importance of this upcoming election and what is at stake for women, girls, families, and essentially all residents in our city and state, because what affects women affects us all. I want to remind you before we get started that our panelists very much want to hear what's on your mind, and they want to answer any questions that you have that are lingering. So please don't be shy. Put your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to work them into this conversation and acknowledge you by name based on your questions. So think of what you want to ask, put it in that chat box for us. Now, let's get started. Earlier this year, the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg blanketed much of our country with sadness and mourning. But it also led to a political event. With this election less than 30 days away, it has already been announced that Amy Coney Barrett has been selected to possibly replace RBG. Jennifer, I want to start with you. Can you talk about this recent announcement as a nominee for the Supreme Court? Can she be confirmed before the election? And what would her appointment mean for women's rights and women and girls? What about here in Illinois? What does that mean for us? And I want you to talk about whether abortion access and women's health care will be protected by state laws if Roe is overturned.
Thank you, Lolly. That's a lot of great information that I'm happy to share with folks. So maybe I'll take it backwards if I can, because I think it's important to reassure people that we have good laws here in Illinois. And I know that some of the people on the panel with me, and probably some of our listeners as well, were responsible for passing HB 40 and the Reproductive Health Act. I see some of my partners and my partners in this work right here with me. And what that means is that Illinois is a haven for reproductive health care in the Midwest. We still have work to do in Illinois. I really want to repeal that Parental Notification Act, but we've come a long way. And that means that as a haven in the Midwest, we're surrounded by states that have way more restrictions on reproductive health care and abortion access. And so here in Illinois, we will still be safe. Our patients, our clients, the people, our family and friends will still be able to get the care they need. It's not so great for most of the rest of the country. I can be perfectly clear. The president's nominee to the court is an arch conservative and will further push the court against access to reproductive care. And it's not just that, it's a lot of things that matter to the women and girls in our city, whether it's voting rights and civil rights, marriage equality, absolutely everything will be on the line if that nomination goes through. And here's the amazing thing, the Senate, and a number of my colleagues have already said this, the Senate is pushing through this nomination at a time when the election has already started. As a matter of fact, today is election day, and so is tomorrow, because people are already voting all over the country and here in Chicagoland. So the election ends in 27 days. It doesn't start, and there's no reason for this nomination to be pushed through by a Senate that couldn't act on a previous nomination because it was the same year as a general election. So I think that the country is definitely struggling. The Senate could be working on a pandemic response. It could be working on getting the help that our states and municipalities really need. And instead, they're pushing through an arch conservative that will damage the court even more for another generation.
Thank you, Jennifer. You made so many valid points and even raised that the process that we're seeing at work now contradicts what has been said in the way this has worked previously, particularly because we are currently in an election. I would like to shift to Linda and get you to weigh in on this. I think sometimes our local voters don't fully understand what a Supreme Court justice means for our daily lives as women, as girls, as head of households, and as decision makers. Can you talk about what this decision could mean?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lali. You know, for a lot of women and girls who are anxious to, understand the repercussions of the election, I think it's really important that they know that the Supreme Court does influence so much of our daily rights. As Jennifer noted, we're really great. It's really great to live in Illinois and be proud residents of a wonderful state. But we have to think about our family members or our friends who live in states that don't have the freedoms that we enjoy as women and girls in this country, and as compared to our other states in the country. I think that's something that's really focused. So I think about my Latina sisters, other immigrant women, other women of color, women who may not speak English as a first language, who may need an abortion or access to contraception and not have that readily available to their state. So when we think about an election, for the president or for senators, we also have to think about the power that they have to influence who will be sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court, and how those decisions can really lead to ramifications for residents that just don't live in a state like Illinois. I think that's part of our duty as women and girls who enjoy certain rights. And I think that's really important. I think the other thing that, we also need to talk about is the Affordable Care Act. For a lot of women of color, single households led by women, having the Affordable Care Act has been a huge benefit for our communities. And the idea that that may be chipped away, just as Roe may be chipped away or abortion rights may be chipped away, something that is very concerning because it's really allowed for families to have preventative care, to have access to women's health that they may never have had. And so I think that that is something that we always have to keep in mind when we're voting, that we may have it great here, but what do we have to do in terms of making sure that we can lift everyone up?
Yes, thank you, Linda. You made so many great points, particularly about healthcare. And sometimes when we're considering the Supreme Court and we think about women's health, we think about reproductive rights, but wrapped in that is also access to overall healthcare, which is so important, particularly during a time of pandemic. So thank you for pointing that out. I think you also made an excellent point that we have to think as local voters that this is not just an issue that impacts us, but that it impacts women across the country. And again, what impacts women impacts us all. So a lot of the conversation this election season has been dominated by the presidential election, but we have some major local decisions to make. For example, this year, Illinois voters are being asked to decide on a fair tax that would change our state's income tax system from a flat tax to a graduated tax. Under this rule, those with higher incomes would pay more than those with lower incomes. What does a fair tax mean for women and girls? I'm going to direct this to both of you, but let's start with you, Linda, and then we'll shift over to Jennifer.
Sure. It's, again, proud to be an Illinois resident. We have some great laws on the books, but we need money. We need money to make sure that we can lift programs, to think innovatively as to how we, introduce, healthy relations curriculum to schools throughout the state of Illinois, to provide after-school program for women and their daughters. I think that's something that's so key. I think about the women entrepreneurs across our state. They have suffered greatly during COVID. All entrepreneurs have, but women, many of whom are maybe survivors of domestic violence, where is the opportunity for us to think about grants or loans, and just having access to more general revenue for the state can really lift our possibilities in terms of thinking more broadly as to what are the programs that we can really try out. And what are the programs that are already really doing well that need more funding, for instance, domestic violence or sexual assault. We've seen domestic violence grow dramatically across the globe, but Illinois is not in a position to provide more service grants under our current tax system. we think, and fair tax can be an opportunity for that. And I think the same thing for sexual assault and a lot of women-centered and girl-centered programs. I think that's something that we have to think about. What have we not been able to invest in because there's not enough revenue? And when is it going to be our time to have those kind of investments? And I think the Fair Tax Amendment is something that really allows us that great opportunity.
Jennifer, can you weigh in? I mean, I think Linda made some excellent points here, but I often think about just personally that as a woman, a Black woman specifically, I tend to earn 60 cents compared to a white male counterpart's $1. What does that income gap mean, particularly when we think about a fair tax and who gets taxed the heaviest in our state and in our city?
Yeah, Lolly, I'm so glad you said that. And as Linda was talking, I was thinking the amazing women who work at Planned Parenthood of Illinois and at Mujeres Latinas, right? Our frontline workers who are predominantly Black and brown women, they pay the same percentage of tax as a corporate CEO here in Illinois. And these are the women who are running families and providing services to the most vulnerable people in our community, or who are innovating programs like Linda talked about. So there's no reason for those community members to be paying the same tax rate as a corporate CEO who wouldn't even miss the funds that they could give to the state and for needed programs. The fact of the matter is during a previous administration, the social service safety net, the health and human services safety net frayed almost to nothing across our state. And the fair tax gives us an opportunity to rebuild that safety net and take care of everybody from young children in early childhood education to seniors in elder care, and important services in the middle, like the ones that are funded by the Chicago Foundation for Women, the ones that are provided by Mujeras Latinas and Planned Parenthood of Illinois. So we really do need to step up here in the state of Illinois, and I hope that everybody supports the fair tax to support the safety net that we need now more than ever.
Speaking of a safety net, Felicia, you are out on the front lines every day fighting for more equity and equality for women in our city and in our state. How are you hearing women talk about this fair tax law? How are they interpreting it, and what does it mean for them?
Lolly, thank you for the question, and also for the comments of Jennifer and Linda before me. The CFW offices are across the street from a headquarters of a major company, a major corporation run by a billionaire. And a couple of weeks ago, I go into the office one day a week to handle some of the items that we can't do remotely. And there happened to be a protest that day. And the signs, overwhelmingly women, many of them were SEIU members, probably working on the front lines in healthcare and other places. And the signs was babies, fund babies, not millionaires, or support babies, not millionaires. So overwhelmingly, in the context of COVID, but even before that, women and caregivers are domestic workers, and so many people of color are carrying the economy kind of on their backs. And it is quite literally, as Jennifer said, the system had been frayed basically, or nearly frayed, because of an impasse for the budget, and so just recovering. But these are really crucial services that aren't being funded. So as I think about the backlog, what about women's safety? And what about just on crime? What about the backlog and rape kit processing? Certainly, more equitable tax structure would provide more funding to help ensure that women have their day in court, that the offender, a violent offender on the street who is harming women, is removed from the street, and to really ensure the safety for all of us. I also think about the maternal health gap in our state, one of the greatest nations in the world, and one of the cities with some of the best healthcare in the entire world. And here in Illinois, a Black woman is nearly 6 times more likely to die in childbirth than anyone else in the state of Illinois. And so what does that mean to be able to fund healthcare? And quite frankly, presently, for women who are having babies or childcare, the south side of our city presently is a healthcare desert with the announced closing of another hospital. So how can we more equitably provide for healthcare services to all of the women and girls in all of our communities? And so there is a lot more at stake, and rightly so. The other thing I think about is the legislative matters and why it was so critical to have a jurist like Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the Supreme Court. But it's also equally important to have jurists who seek equity and believe in equity and are willing to read, all of the millions of pages of laws and or federal codes. So while she's more known for, many women know her for the work around reproductive choice, one of the biggest, most significant things was really around economic security and independence. And so as I think about it, I was having a conversation with a young woman today who just bought her first home. The ability to have a mortgage for yourself in your own name was because of her and the team of lawyers there really reading the federal laws and the lines and lines and lines, hundreds of lines of the laws, and offering an interpretation that really provided for equity, or seeing that the way that the law was written in the past did not provide for equity. So a lot of people skip the bottom of the ballot when it comes to the judicial races. And I will argue that those races are more important, and particularly for people of color. I have conversations with African-American men often because they are more likely than I to come before a judge, rightly or wrong. And we know there are a lot of inequities when it comes to the way in which Black and brown communities are policed. That said, they are more likely to come before a jurist, come before one of the judges on the ballot here locally in our state, which means that they should have a voice also, and the women should have a voice in who's hearing those cases. So there's a lot at stake, Lolly. Thank you so much for that question.
No, thank you, because the way that you've answered that question allows us to open it up even more and kind of go down the ballot, because we are thinking a lot about the Supreme Court and who's going to represent on that court long after this election is over, in the next election, and the next election. But we also have criminal justice and civil and local rights on this ballot too, right? So first, before I get to what's at stake for women, Matt, can you talk about what is on this ballot besides the presidential election that has to do with the criminal justice system, the legal system, that our voters and that our viewers should know when they get their ballot to pay attention to?
You have lots and lots of judges on your ballot, both for retention and running for office for the first time. In the Chicago area, you have a state Supreme Court justice race. So that would be something to keep in mind. There's another district, a downstate district, that has a Supreme Court retention race. Justice Kilbride is up for retention. So keep that in mind. Of course, everyone will be voting on their representative in Congress, and everyone will be voting for their state representative for the Illinois General Assembly, because those are 2-year offices. So, and when you talk about those down ballot races, in the General Assembly, for example, sometimes those local races can have a more direct effect on your life than some of the more high profile races that we see. And it only gets more pronounced as we get, coming up this spring, when the consolidated elections, which are municipal elections, come around. Because then it's literally, your neighbor that you could be electing. But judges, Supreme Court, depending on where you live, whether it's an actual race for an open seat or a retention race, all those circuit judges and appellate judges that are up, certainly those are important as well. There are a lot of them, and they're generally less well known. So you have to do a little research for those races. And then we talked about, obviously, the tax amendment is going to be huge in Illinois, and One thing that we talk about a lot with vote by mail, one question that comes up a lot is, are we going to know on election night what the results are? And what my answer to that is, it really depends on voter behavior. It depends on whether those voters who are voting by mail, if they return their ballots before election day so that the election authorities have those ballots processed and they can just flip a switch and have the totals once the polls close, then yes, we will know. But if we have 2 million voters who are voting by mail, if 1.5 million of them don't return their ballots before election day, then we potentially have 1.5 million mail votes that could arrive and be counted between November 3rd and November 17th. 1.5 million votes or so is significant even in a statewide race in Illinois. So there you could see, for example, the tax amendment, you could see the lead change as the mail ballots come in. And certainly in those down ballot races where, let's say, a state representative race where the margin of victory is only going to be a few thousand votes anyway, there, if you have a district where a significant portion of the electorate's voting by mail, you could see it, and they haven't sent their ballots in, you could see that go up and down quite a bit over those 2 weeks. Although really, I think that between November 3rd and probably November 7th, we'll have the vast majority of the vote will be counted. But one thing that you will be seeing in the days running up to the election and the days after the election is we're going to put out a lot of press releases here, letting people know statewide we still have this many vote by mail ballots that potentially could arrive and be counted. So whatever numbers you're looking at now could change by this amount. We want to make sure that we really hammer that home with people, because in the age of social media and given a lot of the discussion that's gone on about vote by mail in this cycle, we don't want conspiracy theories popping up for why those numbers are changing. It's very simple. The ones that haven't been returned might be returned in those 2 weeks.
Thank you, Matt. There's so much information to be unpacked just from your statement alone, and even what Felicia mentioned earlier. But before we shift into talking about the information war and what that means for voters and turnout, I want to talk a little bit more about what you mentioned regarding this particularly long ballot. One of the issues that's on this ballot is criminal justice and women's rights. In Chicago, we are looking at the state's attorney's race. And as you mentioned, Matt, dozens of judges. Linda, what does this mean for women, for girls, and for our entire city and state? What should we be paying attention to on this particularly long ballot?
Well, first, I think you should always make sure that people have the qualifications. Sometimes I know that there are individuals who run for office to be a judge, and they may or may not have the qualifications to be a judge. So I say, as an attorney, I think that's very important. I think the other thing that is really crucial is to, if spend time looking at their record. What are they? What are they known for? What do they believe in? And that takes some homework, but there are different organizations that actually have done some of that research with regards to those that are running for election. And so if you're passionate about certain issues, I think it's important for you to take that time to see what these individuals believe in. I think that's always important. I think one thing that is really important too is that we need to take the time, all of us, to do the ballots. I think sometimes it's very easy, and I would probably say this when I was a young voter, that I would get overwhelmed by looking at these long ballots. It's important. You never know when someone can make a decision at any local court level that really has a large impact on the rest of the state. And I think that sometimes we don't understand that. And I think that's the larger point that I would like to make, that when we have the election, it's a reminder to all of us the importance of civic participation and why civic education needs to be more stressed in schools, particularly in schools that serve, women of color, girls, in many environments throughout the state. I sometimes really are fearful. I'm very fearful of suburbanization of poverty that has really led to so many women of color and their families to live in suburbs where they may not have the same access, or small towns where they may not have the same access to civic education or organizations that teach them about leadership. So I think that that's something that we need to, use the election as a reminder to young children and to young leaders that this is an opportunity that you will have in the future and you cannot squander. Do your homework, take part, become interested, always stay engaged. And I think that's something that I think that we need to use that as an opportunity of a teaching moment.
Thank you,
Linda. If I could add one more piece, I think Linda says a great point about do your homework. And there's a tool out there exclusively for judges called Voteforjudges.org. All one word, Voteforjudges.org. And what that does is it compiles the results from 12 different bar associations, including the women's bar, the gay GL, gay law is what I always called it. What is it? Leg back? I don't know. Anyway, so the point is that somebody has compiled it all for us. So you can look at those results and say, you know what, it turns out that I care most who the Hispanic Bar Association endorses. I can look down that row and vote for their suggestions, who they've found qualified. So there's a really great tool out there that we can do our homework. And just to put an even finer point on it, when you talk about what it matters for judges, think about that's the person that most of us are likely to actually interact with. That's the person that's going to decide if you get a fair divorce settlement. It's the person who's going to decide if you get an order of protection or how long a criminal sentence will be. So I just want to echo what my colleagues have said about the importance of judges and give that one resource to really help people do the homework that everybody's recommending. Sorry to cut you off. I just didn't want to miss my chance.
No, this was perfect, Jennifer. It was like you read my mind, because I was just going to ask you where you direct people to go to begin to educate themselves before they begin to fill out their mail ballot, or before they go on November 3rd to vote in person or to the polls to vote early. And, both of you bring up some really good points, particularly about being engaged in the process. And so I want to talk to Felicia and pull her in on this point. In the past, historically, we've, as women, have been able to grab a friend or a sister, a colleague, and take them to the polls with us. That's how we have managed, in part, to become such a strong voting bloc. But this year, voting looks so different. How are you encouraging women to empower each other to make sure that they are not just educated, but that they are participating and planning how to vote?
Lolly, that's a good question. And I think in this election in particular, things have gotten a lot more grassroots, neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend, family member to family member, and we are supported by technology. So you can, upload all of your contacts in your phone, all of your family and friends, and you can know whether or not they voted, and also send them a reminder, get them to the polls. There have been a lot of people coming together, in particular women coming together, Chicago, women taking action as an example, Planned Parenthood and others who are encouraging women to, educate each other, to do phone banking and other activities to educate women, making sure everyone understands their access to the ballot, their rights to vote. And so all of that becomes more and more important. And we already, I talked about the stats earlier. Do I need to repeat that number again about how many more women voted than men in the last cycles? So that is significant. And so now it's also about bringing younger voters, bringing those young women voters, because again, some of the things, some of the freedoms, some of the rights that we celebrate and take for granted today, and say a young person takes for granted today, they don't know that those things were only granted within my lifetime. My mother was not eligible to vote when she was born. So these are things we kind of take for granted, not being able to have a mortgage, not to be able to have a checking account, a bank account, a credit card in your name. So those are the types of things that I think younger women, those free, it's like like freedom isn't free, democracy is an action verb. Our friends at Mikvah educate young people into that space every single day, and help them participate in the election process so that they can see that democracy requires all of us. And I just wanted to make one other point, Lolly, because you asked about safety for women, or you asked about the state's attorney's race in particular, and Jennifer touched on this as well. You know, I'm also thinking nationally, so I'm thinking about congressional races. The Violence Against Women Act has not been reauthorized, right? So this was a seminal piece of legislation that really turned the tide for response, how our country and also municipalities fall in line, how you respond to those issues that impact women and girls. It's particularly domestic violence and a lot of other issues. And so thinking about the fullness of what this means for women and girls, and not losing sight of that very important national piece of legislation that still needs to be authorized. So, you know, not necessarily, you know, speaking to people here in Illinois, I know that there are people who are watching us today who are not in Illinois. Who you elect matters. If you care about the safety of women and girls, it matters, matters, matters. Thank you.
No, thank you for that passion and that reminder, because it's not just issues that impact women directly through who's elected. It's also who is the state's attorney, and how are they persecuting crime? How are they managing the criminal justice system and disciplining and managing people who commit violence against us and against our families? Now, in the recent past, Linda, there's been a information war, campaigns that have tried to disenfranchise Black and Latinx voters, encouraging Black and Latinx voters to stay at home, to not participate in this process. And we see, as Felicia has pointed out, that women are getting out and taking advantage of what it means to vote. How can we fight against this disinformation that is circulating in minority and brown and Black communities, telling us to stay at home, that it's not worth it, that it doesn't matter?
Well, I think for one of the most important ways to do is through education, through the media, you know, mainstream media, or media that people trust. Every community trusts different sources of media, whether it's their local radio station or their local TV station. I think that's very important because, you know, that trust is built over a long period of time, and making sure that people hear that message over and over again. What are the warning signs to say, hey, this looks like fake news, or this looks like news that has been fabricated to twist our minds in a certain way, our positions in a certain way. And I think that's really important. I don't think a lot of individuals understand the dangers of looking at social media, and what can be posted there cannot be true. And so I think that is the first thing. I think the second thing is just really starts when we're young. And I'm so glad that Felicia brought up Mikvah Challenge, because I think that's a really good example of, you got to teach folks early on that their voice matters. Their vote matters, that they need to be active, that we want to hear from them, and that they have an opportunity to teach us how to be better, those that are in power. And I think that's really important to do that. And one of the things that we do at Mujeres Latinas is we have a Latina leadership program, and we talk about civic participation. We talk about leadership. We talk about what is the political education? What is our government like here in the United States, particularly for immigrant women who may not have interacted with elections or with voting in their home country, or may come from a country where there really is no democracy. And granted, we have problems with US democracy, but we're far ahead many other countries. So I think that is something that we have to have really honest conversations with, and also make sure that parents understand that they have a responsibility too to encourage their children to vote. Because I'm often discouraged when I find out that there's so many 20-year-olds in my community that are not voting because they feel disenfranchised. And I think that's something that we all should play a part in making sure that folks feel that their voice matters and their vote matters at all times.
Mm-hmm. Linda, again, you make so many wonderful points. And Jennifer, I wonder if you can comment on this. What obligation do we who are registered and able to vote, what obligation do we have to all the people who are not given this opportunity, whether it's because they are not properly documented or because they're not of age? What do we owe the people who come behind us by going to the polls?
Boy, that's a great question. And it's interesting because I've seen some graphics that remind us that in the last election, only X% of people voted, and there were more people who didn't vote than did. And I wish that that graphic showed the people who were ineligible to vote because of voter suppression, because it's a real problem. Some people choose not to vote, but some people are deliberately pushed off of the voting polls by those who are invested in a low voter turnout. And so I feel like those of us who are eligible to vote and who haven't been targeted for suppression, we have a responsibility to speak not only for ourselves, as Linda says, because we have a civic responsibility, but we have to speak for our friends and neighbors who have been pushed off unfairly.
And Lolly, can I add something there too?
Please.
I also personally feel, and I think we should all feel an obligation for the people who came before us. So as I think about the people who were starved and force-fed and jailed and mistreated and hosed with fire hoses and dogs were put upon them, the people who literally die for me to have this right. And so for me, as my identity as a African American, and also my identity as a woman. So in the intersectional analysis of this, there are a lot of people who came before me, and I have an obligation to pay their debt, to pay this debt that I owe to them by participating in this process that they fought so hard for me to have.
Yes, absolutely. I want to turn to Matt. We're quickly running out of time, but Linda and Felicia have brought up some really important points, and so has Jennifer, particularly about sharing information and sharing resources. For those of us who want to make sure that we are sharing credible, legitimate, and accurate information about the voting process, Matt, how do we make sure that we're sharing good information and that we're not spreading myths and untruths?
Sure. Well, start if you have questions about anything pertaining to voting or registration or the election process, start at our website, which is elections.il.gov. On the landing page, there's a whole section, a tab that says information for voters. If you hover over that, you'll see a drop-down menu. It'll tell you, you can search for all the early voting locations and hours in your jurisdiction. You can find out where the drop boxes are if you want to drop off a mail ballot. On our website too, you can apply for a vote by mail ballot. We've got a very simple step-by-step process that will take you right through and link you up with if it's Chicago or Cook County or the Collar counties, it'll link you right with the county's website so you can put in your application there. I shared with the chat our online voter registration site. We always say registration never closes in Illinois, but online registration will close at the end of the day, October 18th, a week from next Sunday. And so share that link with anybody who you think is not already registered to vote. That's the easiest way to register. If you don't want to do that, or if you miss that deadline, just go to an early voting location and register there in person. Even if you don't have the right ID with you, you can vote provisionally then, and you can provide the ID later. But it's really important that we really help other people. If you have, especially younger people who they haven't voted before, maybe they haven't registered before, help them, let them know it's a simple process. There's no need to be intimidated by it. And, like I was saying earlier, yes, there's been all this talk about voting by mail and COVID and polling places and everything else, but voters need to realize this is going to be pretty much the same process that you've always done. It's just that you'll be doing it in a mask, you'll be socially distanced, and you might want to try to avoid going during really busy times. But it's really important that, on a very basic level, help each other. If you have an older relative who wants to vote by mail, make sure that, help them fill out that ballot, make sure it's properly sealed and that they sign it.
Thank
Help
you.
them get it done plenty early.
Thank you. Thank you. We must help each other and serve each other, and most of all, ensure that we all participate in this election because our lives are counted on it. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Linda, for this wonderful conversation. It always feels that once it gets started, it's time to shut it down. But with this, I need to turn it back over to Felicia, who is going to close us out.
Lolly, thank you for facilitating this really engaging and thought-provoking conversation. Matt, Linda, and Jennifer, thank you all for joining us today and ensuring everyone has the information that they need to advocate for themselves, to vote, but also to bring family and friends along. Thank you to the audience for engaging and learning with us what's at stake for women and girls during this election cycle. And also a special thanks to Ajin Pu for sharing with us her thoughtful remarks by video. This conversation leaves me feeling uplifted and encouraged to continue to participate and bring others along in the democratic process. I hope it encouraged all of you to really push past the misinformation that perhaps is out there that may have a discouraging note to it. For our part, CFW is committed to supporting all women and centering our work in community. These types of conversations help remind us of the power we yield as women and allies of women, or allies to women. Our voices, our experiences matter, and certainly our votes matter, or they would not be trying to suppress them. We are living in unprecedented times, and the needs across our communities continue to grow. Please do continue to do what you can to take care of yourself. I always think about on the airplane, put your own oxygen mask on first, and as you take care of others, because we know that you are out there helping in our communities and your communities every single day. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.